5:47 a.m. The roar of a diesel engine ripped me out of sleep like a home invasion alarm set off by a power-drunk trespasser pretending they owned my property. I stepped outside in nothing but boxers, barefoot on cold gravel, and watched my 28-foot Grady White, 3 years of double shifts and skipped vacations, already chained to a tow truck like stolen trash, being hauled away before the sun could expose the crime. Not one warning, not one notice. Just a silent ambush carried out under the authority of a clipboard parasite whose only 5:47 a.m. The roar of a diesel engine ripped me out of sleep like a home invasion alarm set off by a power-drunk trespasser pretending they owned my property. I stepped outside in nothing but boxers, barefoot on cold gravel, and watched my 28-foot Grady White, 3 years of double shifts and skipped vacations, already chained to a tow truck like stolen trash, being hauled away before the sun could expose the crime. Not one warning, not one notice. Just a silent ambush carried out under the authority of a clipboard parasite whose only skill was intimidation disguised as enforcement. And there she stood, Delilah Westbrook, arms crossed in her $300 Lululemon set like she was posing for the cover of Dictator's trash, being hauled away before the sun could expose the crime. Not one warning, not one notice. Just a silent ambush carried out under the authority of a clipboard parasite whose only skill was intimidation disguised as enforcement. And there she stood, Delilah Westbrook, arms crossed in her $300 Lululemon set like she was posing for the cover of Dictator's Power. And power is the only language people like her think they understand. But inside, something locked into place. The kind of cold clarity that doesn't shake, doesn't shout, doesn't break. The kind that waits. Before we get any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. Power. And power is the only language people like her think they understand. But inside, something locked into place. The kind of cold clarity that doesn't shake, doesn't shout, doesn't break. The kind that waits. Before we get any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. Because what happened next didn't just break her power trip, it erased it permanently. But that's not even the half of it. The chain clanked against the trailer as because what happened next didn't just break her power trip. It erased it permanently. But that's not even the half of it. The chain clanked against the trailer as the tow truck rolled forward, dragging $33,000 of my life savings toward the street like it was bulk trash scheduled for collection. The tow truck rolled forward, dragging $33,000 of my life savings toward the street like it was bulk trash scheduled for collection. 3 years of overtime dissolved in 60 seconds under fake enforcement she created to humiliate me publicly. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, pretending they weren't. 3 years of overtime dissolved in 60 seconds under fake enforcement she created to humiliate me publicly. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, pretending they weren't watching a man's property get stolen under the flag of community rules. Delilah didn't look at the boat. She looked at me, like she wanted to see what it looked like when a man realized watching a man's property get stolen under the flag of community rules. Delilah didn't look at the boat. She looked at me, like she wanted to see what it looked like when a man realized. Letting her finish digging the hole. The tow truck driver didn't make eye contact. He kept his head down like a man who had been told to do something that didn't sit right with his conscience, but not wrong enough to lose a paycheck. That's how HOA dictators operate. They never get their own hands dirty. They outsource the violation so they can pretend their involvement is administrative instead of personal. Delilah turned to leave like the performance was complete, like the lesson had been delivered and the audience dismissed. But that's where she miscalculated, because humiliation only works when the target believes it. And I wasn't the target she thought I was. Let me back up and explain how a quiet boat mechanic ended up in a war with a woman who treated neighborhood guidelines like holy scripture and herself like the chosen interpreter. I'm Marcus Kellerman, 52 years old, and I've spent my entire life elbow deep in boat engines, breathing diesel fumes, wiping motor oil from hands that never came clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. 20 years living above my shop in a cramped apartment where the walls rattled when trucks passed, and the only luxury I owned was the belief that nobody could tell me how to live. I wasn't rich, I wasn't polished, I didn't fit into HOA Fantasyland. Wiping motor oil from hands that never came clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. 20 years living above my shop in a cramped apartment where the walls rattled when trucks passed, and the only luxury I owned was the belief that nobody could tell me how to live. I wasn't rich, I wasn't polished, I didn't fit into HOA Fantasyland. Wiping motor oil from hands that never came clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. 20 years living above my shop in a cramped apartment where the walls rattled when trucks passed, and the only luxury I owned was the belief that nobody could tell me how to live. I wasn't rich, I wasn't polished, I didn't fit into HOA Fantasyland. But at least in that old life, nobody pretended to own me. The smell of WD-40 and gasoline wasn't a problem until I moved into a place where people believed air itself needed permission. And that's when everything changed, because of Uncle Ezra. The man everyone called eccentric because they didn't understand that peace looks like madness to people addicted to the past, and the only luxury I owned was the belief that nobody could tell me how to live. I wasn't rich, I wasn't polished, I didn't fit into HOA Fantasyland. But at least in that old life, nobody pretended to own me. The smell of WD-40 and gasoline wasn't a problem until I moved into a place where people believed air itself needed permission. And that's when everything changed, because of Uncle Ezra. The man everyone called eccentric because they didn't understand that peace looks like madness to people addicted. But at least in that old life, nobody pretended to own me. The smell of WD-40 and gasoline wasn't a problem until I moved into a place where people believed air itself needed permission. And that's when everything changed, because of Uncle Ezra. The man everyone called eccentric because they didn't understand that peace looks like madness to people addicted. She was performing authority in yoga pants. I was holding the one truth that could end her entire kingdom. She tried to take my boat. I could take her lake. And the best part? She handed me the reason. That morning wasn't just theft. It was permission. Because once someone crosses a line, there's no rule left to respect. And the tow truck rolling away wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. The moment she learned what happens when a woman addicted to control pushes the one man she should have left alone. The next part of this story is where everything snaps. And trust me, she never saw it coming. That tow truck didn't just carry my boat. It carried the last peaceful moment she would ever have in Willowbrook Estates. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and for the first time since moving there, I didn't feel like a stranger in someone else's world. I felt like the owner of the battlefield. Still with me? Good. Because what happened next made that morning look like a warm-up. And Delilah Westbrook was just about to learn that the difference between authority and power is simple. Authority is claimed. Power is proven. Here's where everything blew apart. I didn't grow up in places where people weaponized property lines or measured their worth by square footage and lawn symmetry. I grew up in a world where you earned silence by fixing what was broken, not by enforcing what was never a problem. For most of my life, I lived above my boat repair shop in a cramped apartment where the walls smelled like gasoline and thyme. The floors shook every time a semi rolled past, and nobody cared because nobody was pretending to curate perfection. I woke up to diesel engines every morning long before any HOA parasite decided to use one against me. My hands were permanently stained with motor oil, and the closest thing I had to retirement planning was a coffee can full of spare change and a promise to myself that one day I'd buy a real boat, not to show off but to breathe. For 20 years, the only rules I answered to were the ones written on service invoices and Marine Corps muscle memory. I didn't need acceptance. I didn't need neighbors. I needed quiet and water. I never got either until the day my phone rang and everything shifted like fate finally got tired of waiting. The lawyer on the line spoke like a man delivering news he expected to be questioned. Your uncle Ezra Kellerman has left his estate to you. Tired of waiting. The lawyer on the line spoke like a man delivering news he expected to be questioned. Your uncle Ezra Kellerman has left his estate to you. I actually laughed because life doesn't usually hand lakefront property to men who fix carburetors for a living. Life hands bills, not keys. But when Sarah and I drove out where I came from, the moment my boots hit the gravel, everything in front of me looked like it belonged to someone who wore linen, not denim. 3 acres of untouched land, a house that didn't squeak, a private dock stretching into water so clear it felt like seeing into the future. I didn't know how to stand still in a place that wasn't falling apart. The air tasted clean in a way that made my lungs suspicious. It smelled like honeysuckle instead of exhaust, and I didn't trust it at first. People like me don't get paradise without a catch, but Ezra wasn't the kind of man who believed in catches. Everyone called him eccentric because people who can't be controlled are always labeled defective by those who need hierarchy to feel alive. Ezra lived alone for decades, turning down every developer who waved million-dollar checks under the illusion that everything has a price. He wasn't stubborn. He was immune. The neighborhood talked about him like a warning story. Don't get too independent or you'll end up like the strange man on the lake. What they meant was don't get too free. When I walked through the house he left behind, I didn't feel lucky. I felt unprepared. The walls were lined with photographs who need hierarchy to feel alive. Ezra lived alone for decades, turning down every developer who waved million-dollar checks under the illusion that everything has a price. He wasn't stubborn. He was immune. The neighborhood talked about him like a warning story. Don't get too independent or you'll end up like the strange man on the lake. Of a life spent choosing solitude over approval, and I didn't understand why he picked me to inherit that legacy. But the truth became clear later. He didn't choose me because I fit the... What they meant was don't get too free. I felt unprepared. The walls were lined with photographs who need hierarchy to feel alive. Ezra lived alone for decades, turning down every developer who waved million-dollar checks under the illusion that everything has a price. He wasn't stubborn. He was immune. The neighborhood talked about him like a warning story. Don't get too independent or you'll end up like the strange man on the lake. The mailbox ended when I walked past, like I was a storm cloud drifting into their weather-controlled universe. Homeowners who didn't bother learning my name still noticed the grease stains on my shirts. They scanned me like a security threat disguised as a neighbor. I told myself it didn't matter because belonging was never something I needed. But belonging and being targeted are not the same thing. And the shift from silence to surveillance happened faster than I realized. The first time Delilah Westbrook crossed the property line, I understood what kind of world I had moved into. She didn't introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like a border agent. Her heels clicked across my porch like she was walking into a courtroom where she expected a confession. "Welcome to Willowbrook," she said, but her eyes were inspecting my boat like a code violation waiting to happen. She used the word imposing the way a surgeon uses the word malignant, something that needs to be removed before it spreads. She didn't need to raise her voice because people like her don't communicate with volume. They communicate with certainty, and certainty, in the wrong hands, is more dangerous than rage. She handed me a printed copy of the aesthetic guidelines like it was scripture, and she was the chosen interpreter. Section 7.3, she pointed out, specifically addresses oversized recreational equipment disrupting neighborhood harmony. Harmony. That's the word tyrants use when they want obedience without resistance. I thanked her without meaning it because the only thing more dangerous than a bully is they communicate with certainty, and certainty, in the wrong hands, is more dangerous than rage. She handed me a printed copy of the aesthetic guidelines like it was scripture, and she was the chosen interpreter. Section 7.3, she pointed out, specifically addresses oversized recreational equipment disrupting neighborhood harmony. Scripture, and she was the chosen interpreter. Section 7.3, she pointed out, specifically addresses oversized recreational equipment disrupting neighborhood harmony. Harmony. That's the word tyrants use when they want obedience without resistance. I thanked her without meaning it because the only thing more dangerous than a bully is a bully who thinks they're the hero. That moment didn't feel like a greeting. It felt like a warning. And the worst part was I didn't even know the rule she cited wasn't the rule that makes them brave. That was the day I realized I hadn't moved into a neighborhood. I had moved into a controlled environment. A social laboratory run by a woman who believed authority was a personality trait. Willowbrook wasn't beautiful because it was peaceful. It was peaceful because it was policed. And the worst part about systems like that is how easily they convince good people to accept bad power. Neighbors who smiled at me one day stopped making eye contact the next. Whisper networks replaced conversation. Compliance replaced community. I wasn't being welcomed. I was being evaluated. And when I failed the unspoken test of belonging, when my presence disrupted the illusion of uniform perfection, Delilah decided that I was a problem that required correction. But she wasn't correcting me. She was provoking me. Because people like her don't understand the danger of pushing a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. I didn't move to Willowbrook to start a war. I moved there because I thought the lake would finally give me peace. What I didn't know was that the lake was the only reason the war would end in my favor. Because the one thing Delilah could never control was the one thing she depended on. And while she spent years building her paper throne, she never once considered that someone else owned the ground beneath it. She thought the community belonged to her. I was a problem that required correction. But she wasn't correcting me. She was provoking me. Because people like her don't understand the danger of pushing a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear. I didn't move to Willowbrook to start a war. I moved there because I thought the lake would finally give me peace. She just didn't read the fine print. The part where everything she controlled depended on access I could take away with one signature. And the most dangerous part wasn't that she underestimated me. It was that she never even thought to look. The war didn't begin with the tow truck. It began with paperwork. Because in neighborhoods like Willowbrook, the most dangerous weapon isn't a fist or a threat. It's a rule rewritten when nobody's looking. The first real shift happened 3 days after Delilah inspected my boat. They want panic. They want apology. They want compliance disguised as resolution. I set the letter down and read it again. Then again. The words weren't written to inform me. They were written to intimidate me. Violations may result in escalating fines and potential lien action. The sentence wasn't about boats. It was about control. But that's not even the half of it. The violation claimed the rule had been active when I moved in, and that's where everything blew apart. I drove to the county courthouse that afternoon, walked past the dusty trophy cases, and requested the original HOA covenants from 1987. The clerk handed me documents older than half the residents in Willowbrook. No boat restrictions anywhere. Recreational vehicles referred only to RVs and trailers. The language was clean, untouched, impossible to misinterpret. But then I found it. The December 2022 amendment slipped through when half the neighborhood was tanning in Florida. Recreational vessels exceeding community aesthetic standards now prohibited. 7 signatures, 15 households. No proper notice, no quorum, no legality. Delilah didn't enforce rules. She manufactured them. And the worst part was the community didn't know. They didn't question it because questioning the HOA feels like questioning gravity. You only notice the problem when you fall. I walked out of that courthouse with more than paperwork. I walked out with clarity. Delilah wasn't maintaining standards. She was expanding her territory, and I wasn't the first casualty. That night, the neighborhood started talking to me differently. Not loudly, but quietly. The way people speak when they're afraid someone might hear them. Jim Morrison stopped me at the mailbox, eyes darting around before whispering, "She got my work truck last year." But then I found it. The December 2022 amendment slipped through when half the neighborhood was tanning in Florida. Recreational vessels exceeding community aesthetic standards now prohibited. 7 signatures, 15 households. No proper notice, no quorum, no legality. Delilah didn't enforce rules. She manufactured them. And the worst part was the community didn't know. They didn't question it because questioning the HOA feels like questioning gravity. You only notice the problem when you fall. I walked out of that courthouse with more than paperwork. I walked out with clarity. Delilah wasn't maintaining standards. 5-foot yacht sat untouched at the community dock like a floating punchline. It didn't matter that 6 other oversized boats were scattered across the neighborhood. Selective enforcement wasn't accidental. It was strategic. I realized then that Delilah didn't need rules to be real. She just needed them to be believable. And fear makes anything believable. So I stopped reacting and started documenting. That weekend, I became the HOA's worst nightmare. A man with a tape measure, a camera, and nothing left to lose. I walked the neighborhood like a surveyor marking a battlefield. Boat lengths, dock placements, storage locations, photographic evidence, time-stamped, organized, irrefutable. 6 boats over 25 feet, not including mine, not including hers. Every one of them untouched. Enforcement wasn't about compliance. It was about control. But that's not even the half of it. On Monday, a 3rd envelope arrived. Certified mail from Hoffman and Associates, the HOA's attack dog law firm. The paper was thick enough to feel expensive, embossed with a letterhead designed to make normal people feel small. Continued violations may result in property liens and forced compliance measures. Property liens. Over 3 feet of fiberglass. My hands didn't shake, because fear is what happens before the truth arrives. I read the letter twice, set it down, and realized Delilah still believed she was dealing with a man who had no leverage. a man who would fold before the pressure became unbearable. But pressure doesn't break everyone. Sometimes it sharpens them, and that's when everything snapped into focus. The HOA wasn't a board, and forced compliance measures. Property liens. Over 3 feet of fiberglass. My hands didn't shake, because fear is what happens before the truth arrives. I read the letter twice, set it down, and realized Delilah still believed she was dealing with a man who had no leverage, a man who would fold before the pressure became unbearable. But pressure doesn't break everyone. Sometimes it sharpens them, and that's when everything snapped into focus. The HOA wasn't a board. It was a hierarchy. Delilah at the top, 3 loyalists beneath her, silent followers below them. Approval traded like currency. Compliance purchased with intimidation. And everyone else learning to stay small to stay safe. But safety bought through silence is a debt that never stops collecting. The next phase of her power play came disguised as community concern. Residents began receiving newsletters about maintaining neighborhood standards to protect property values. A sentence that sounds harmless until you understand its code for obedience. Conversations near the clubhouse shifted when I walked past. People lowered their voices. They didn't avoid me out of hatred. No longer legally park in the community. My income wasn't affected by chance. It was targeted, cut at the throat. She wasn't trying to inconvenience me, she was trying to bankrupt me. But that's not even the half of it. The following morning, a manila envelope arrived taped to my door like a death sentence. Emergency assessment. $3,200 per household for enhanced security measures. Enhanced security. 2 days after my trailer tires were slashed and the community cameras conveniently malfunctioned. Delilah didn't want more security. She wanted more funding, and fear is the easiest way to collect it. But even fear has limits, because power only works when nobody pushes back. And the moment the first person does, the entire structure begins to shake. I didn't need to win the neighborhood. I only needed to break the illusion that Delilah was untouchable. The shift began quietly, Beatrice showing up shaken after dark, whispering that she wasn't the only one being targeted. Dr. Patel revealing he'd received violation notices for decorative garden gnomes that allegedly violated cultural aesthetic standards. A teenager banned from the community dock for loitering. He was feeding ducks. Delilah wasn't enforcing rules. She was punishing disobedience. And the neighborhood wasn't peaceful. It was terrified. But fear is a temporary currency. Eventually people get tired of paying. I saw it in their eyes. The moment when humiliation transforms into anger. The moment when silence stops feeling safe. The moment a community becomes combustible. And Delilah never saw it coming, because when people believe they have no power, they stay quiet. But when they discover someone else does, they stop being victims and start being witnesses. And witnesses are dangerous. The night Beatrice showed up trembling on my porch was the night I realized the truth about Willowbrook estates. It wasn't beautiful. It was controlled. It wasn't peaceful. It was silenced. And the silence was cracking, section by section, person by person, violation by violation. Delilah thought she was tightening her grip. She was loosening it, because control doesn't collapse when someone resists. It collapses when someone stops believing in it. And the moment she tried to take my boat, she didn't just cross a line. She erased it. The only thing more dangerous than a dictator is a dictator who doesn't know the rules no longer apply. And Delilah Westbrook was about to learn that the only thing more humiliating than losing power is realizing you never actually had it. The turning point didn't arrive with shouting or some dramatic confrontation. It arrived in silence, in the dusty air of a county records room that smelled like old paper and forgotten promises. While Delilah was busy manufacturing violations and poisoning the neighborhood against me, I was busy doing something she never expected. I was reading, I was digging, I was looking for the one thing she didn't believe existed, proof that her entire kingdom was built on ground she didn't own. Rodriguez met me at the courthouse that morning with a stack of files under her arm and the calm expression of someone who already knew the ending before the story started. She didn't waste time with sympathy or reassurance. She flipped open the first folder and slid it across the table toward me like she was dealing a weapon. This is the original 1956 land grant tied to your uncle's property. The paper looked older than both of us combined. The ink faded but still powerful enough to shift an entire neighborhood. What I saw next didn't just change the situation, it detonated it. The grant didn't transfer lakefront property. It transferred the lake. The entire 47 acres. The water, the lake bed, the shoreline. Every dock, every slip, every inch under the sun. The rights weren't shared. They weren't conditional. What I saw next didn't just change the situation, it detonated it. The grant didn't transfer lakefront property. It transferred the lake. The entire 47 acres. The water, the lake bed, the shoreline. Every dock, every slip, every inch under the sun. The rights weren't shared. They weren't conditional. They weren't part of the neighborhood's jurisdiction. They belonged to my uncle. And now they belonged to me. I didn't speak for a full 10 seconds because understanding and believing are not the same thing. My entire world recalibrated in silence. Delilah had spent months trying to control 3 feet of boat length, while I owned 47 acres of. They weren't part of the neighborhood's jurisdiction. They belonged to my uncle. And now they belonged to me. I didn't speak for a full 10 seconds because understanding and believing are not the same thing. My entire world recalibrated in silence. Delilah had spent months trying to control 3 feet of boat length, while I owned 47 acres of water she depended on. But that's not even the half of it. Rodriguez pulled out a second document, the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust established in 1987. My uncle had created a legal structure separate from the HOA, separate from the subdivision, separate from every arrogant assumption the neighborhood ever made about ownership. The trust held exclusive control over the lake and included a 50-foot buffer around the entire shoreline. That meant every private dock, every community walkway, every boat storage area existed under my authority, not Delilah's. And here's where everything blew apart. The trust contained a clause that changed everything. Licensed recreational use, they weren't part of the neighborhood's jurisdiction. They belonged to my uncle. And now they belonged to me. I didn't speak for a full 10 seconds because understanding and believing are not the same thing. My entire world recalibrated in silence. Delilah had spent months trying to control 3 feet of boat length, while I owned 47 acres of. They weren't part of the neighborhood's jurisdiction. They belonged to my uncle. And now they belonged to me. I didn't speak for a full 10 seconds because understanding and believing are not the same thing. My entire world recalibrated in silence. Delilah had spent months trying to control 3 feet of boat length, while I owned 47 acres of water she depended on. But that's not even the half of it. Rodriguez pulled out a second document, the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust established in 1987. My uncle had created a legal structure separate from the HOA, separate from the subdivision, separate from every arrogant assumption the neighborhood ever made about ownership. length, while I owned 47 acres of water she depended on. But that's not even the half of it. Rodriguez pulled out a second document, the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust, established in 1987. My uncle had created a legal structure separate from the HOA, separate from the subdivision, separate from every arrogant assumption the neighborhood ever made about ownership. Water she depended on. But that's not even the half of it. Rodriguez pulled out a second document, the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust, established in 1987. My uncle had created a legal structure separate from the HOA, separate from the subdivision, separate from every arrogant assumption the neighborhood ever made about ownership. Water she depended on. But that's not even the half of it. Rodriguez pulled out a second document, the Clearwater Lake Conservation Trust, established in 1987. My uncle had created a legal structure separate from the HOA, separate from the subdivision, separate from every arrogant assumption the neighborhood ever made about ownership. The trust held exclusive control over the lake and included a 50-foot buffer around the entire shoreline. That meant every private dock, every community walkway, every boat storage area existed under my authority, not Delilah's. And here's where everything blew apart. The trust contained a clause that changed everything. Licensed recreational use. The trust held exclusive control over the lake and included a 50-foot buffer around the entire shoreline. That meant every private dock, every community walkway, every boat storage area existed under my authority, not Delilah's. And here's where everything blew apart. The trust contained a clause that changed everything. Licensed recreational use. The trust held exclusive control over the lake and included a 50-foot buffer around the entire shoreline. That meant every private dock, every community walkway, every boat storage area existed under my authority, not Delilah's. And here's where everything blew apart. The trust contained a clause that changed everything. Licensed recreational use. The trust held exclusive control over the lake and included a 50-foot buffer around the entire shoreline. That meant every private dock, every community walkway, every boat storage area existed under my authority, not Delilah's. And here's where everything blew apart. The trust contained a clause that changed everything. Licensed recreational use. Ducks. It wasn't enforcement, it was punishment. Selective, deliberate, systematic. And the neighborhood was collapsing under it. People weren't living in fear of rules, they were living in fear of attention. That was the night the first line was crossed, not by Delilah, but by the community. Beatrice wasn't asking for help. She was asking for proof that she wasn't insane. I told her the truth. She wasn't. Delilah was. And that truth did something rules never could. It united people. The following days changed everything. Residents began showing up quietly at my workshop, not to gossip, not to complain, but to confess. Violation letters, threatening emails, intimidation patterns, retaliatory fines. People who had been silent for years finally spoke because someone else finally could listen. And here's where everything blew apart. We didn't form a rebellion. We formed a record. Dates, times, photos, names, patterns, enforcement inconsistencies, retaliatory timelines, selective application of rules. It wasn't resistance, it was documentation. And documentation is the one thing dictators can't survive. But that's not even the half of it. While the neighborhood was waking up, Delilah made the biggest mistake of her life. She stopped hiding. She escalated. My workshop windows shattered at 2:47 a.m. Tools smashed. Engine parts scattered like shrapnel, spray paint across the wall. Leave now or else. The cameras that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for weeks didn't matter. I had installed hidden backups. They recorded everything. Leave now or else. The cameras that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for weeks didn't matter. I had installed hidden backups. They recorded everything. The truck that pulled up belonged to Westbrook Marine. The man who stepped out was Richard Westbrook. But the passenger who remained in the truck was the one giving instructions. Delilah herself. The HOA president was no longer pretending to enforce rules. She was committing felonies, and the proof wasn't hearsay. Leave now or else. The cameras that had been mysteriously malfunctioning for weeks didn't matter. I had installed hidden backups. They recorded everything. This is coordinated criminal activity. And that was the moment the power flipped. Delilah didn't know yet, but the neighborhood was already changing hands. And the best part was she was still digging, because when desperate people run out of control, they don't stop. They escalate. She filed a restraining order claiming I was a threat. She believed it would silence me forever. She didn't understand what restraining orders require. Sworn testimony under oath. She didn't understand that perjury is a felony. She didn't understand that walking into that courtroom was the same as walking into a trap she built with her own hands. And the only thing left between that moment and her collapse was time. The proof existed. The documentation was complete. The leverage was real. The lake was mine. The trust was binding. The access was conditional. The money was untouched. The violations were recorded. The harassment was undeniable. And the truth was no longer quiet. Delilah Westbrook still believed she was winning. Collapse was time. The proof existed. The documentation was complete. The leverage was real. The lake was mine. The trust was binding. The access was conditional. The money was untouched. The violations were recorded. The harassment was undeniable. And the truth was no longer quiet. Delilah Westbrook still believed she was winning. Collapse was time. The proof existed. The documentation was complete. The leverage was real. The lake was mine. The trust was binding. The access was conditional. The money was untouched. The violations were recorded. The harassment was undeniable. And the truth was no longer quiet. Delilah Westbrook still believed she was winning. She had no idea the next move wasn't hers. It was mine. Delilah thought she still controlled the narrative, even after the workshop attack, even after Officer Bradley left with evidence that could put her in handcuffs. That's the thing about people drunk on authority. They don't recognize the moment when power stops protecting them and starts exposing them. He assaulted the mailman and made violent statements toward Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who used to hand me homemade banana bread before Delilah rewired her brain with fear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply stepped aside and let the officers search every inch of my property. Because the truth doesn't panic. The truth waits. Neighbors watched from behind blinds, their windows glowing like surveillance cameras. Delilah wanted humiliation. She wanted the image burned into the neighborhood, police surrounding the outsider. But here's where everything blew apart. Mrs. Patterson's timeline didn't match reality. She claimed I made threats Tuesday afternoon. But courthouse security footage showed I was with Rodriguez that entire day. The newspaper delivery kid allegedly targeted wasn't even in the state that week, according to his phone's geolocation. The mailman confirmed he hadn't spoken to me in months. Every lie Delilah had weaponized was collapsing like rotten wood under pressure. Officer Bradley closed his notebook slowly. Mr. Kellerman, based on the evidence and conflicting statements, we are not pursuing further action at this time. But that wasn't the victory. The victory was the look in his eyes. The moment he stopped seeing me as a suspect and started seeing me as a target of harassment. That night, the silence in the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. Delilah didn't understand that once people witness the truth, even quietly, the lie starts dying on its own. But she wasn't finished losing. She was about to walk herself into the one room where power can't protect anyone, a courtroom. Friday morning, the courthouse parking lot was packed. Channel 8's news van sat parked near the entrance, the camera crew already rolling as Delilah stood in front of the microphones, rehearsing her victim performance. She wore a navy blazer instead of workout leggings, her hair perfectly styled like she was attending a political fundraiser instead of... That night, the silence in the neighborhood felt different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was anticipation. Delilah didn't understand that once people witness the truth, even quietly, the lie starts dying on its own. But she wasn't finished losing. She was about to walk herself into the one room where power can't protect anyone, a courtroom. A legal reckoning. Mr. Kellerman poses a threat to community safety, she told the reporter, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. We fear for our lives. Friday morning, the courthouse parking lot was packed. Channel 8's news van sat parked near the entrance, the camera crew already rolling as Delilah stood in front of the microphones, rehearsing her victim performance. She wore a navy blazer instead of workout leggings, her hair perfectly styled like she was attending a political fundraiser instead of... Workshop destruction had been done by unknown vandals, and that she feared retaliation. And then Rodriguez stood up, and the temperature in the room dropped. Mrs. Westbrook, you testified that Mr. Kellerman threatened you Tuesday evening at your residence. Yes, I did. You are certain of the date and time? Absolutely. Rodriguez turned towards the judge. Your Honor, I would like to enter into evidence courthouse security footage showing Mr. Kellerman was meeting with me from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. on the date in question, 3 miles away from Mrs. Westbrook's property. The room froze. The blood drained from Delilah's face so fast it looked like gravity had ripped it out of her. But that was only the beginning. Rodriguez approached the bench with a second file. Your Honor, we also submit video surveillance capturing Mrs. Westbrook present during the break-in at Mr. Kellerman's workshop. Judge Martinez leaned forward like she needed to confirm her own eyes. The footage played on the monitor. Richard Westbrook climbing out of the truck, 2 men smashing windows, and Delilah sitting in the passenger seat giving instructions. The timestamp was unmistakable. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just stillness. It was the sound of a reputation collapsing. Mrs. Westbrook, Judge Martinez said. The timestamp was unmistakable. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just stillness. It was the sound of a reputation collapsing. Mrs. Westbrook, Judge Martinez said, her voice flat with disbelief. This evidence directly contradicts your sworn testimony. Can you explain this? Delilah's mouth opened and closed without sound. The timestamp was unmistakable. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just stillness. It was the sound of a reputation collapsing. Mrs. Westbrook, Judge Martinez said, her voice flat with disbelief. This evidence directly contradicts your sworn testimony. Can you explain this? Delilah's mouth opened and closed without sound. But they would. Everyone would. When we walked out of the courthouse, the reporter rushed toward us, but Rodriguez didn't stop. No comment at this time. The humiliation didn't need narration. It was already spreading. By the time Delilah returned to Willowbrook, word had outrun her. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stared openly, not with fear, but with recognition. The spell was breaking. But that's not even the half of it. The emergency HOA meeting was still scheduled for that night, because even cornered animals follow instinct. Delilah still believed she could salvage control. She underestimated how fast the ground had already vanished beneath her. That evening, I walked into the Willowbrook clubhouse, not as an outsider, but as the only person in the room who knew exactly how the night would end. Every homeowner showed up. Not just the loyalists, not just the fearful. Everyone. The air inside was thick with the kind of tension that exists right before a thunderstorm breaks a long drought. Delilah sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her smile gone, her voice strained as she tried to start the meeting. Breaks a long drought. Delilah sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her smile gone, her voice strained as she tried to start the meeting. Breaks a long drought. Delilah sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her smile gone, her voice strained as she tried to start the meeting. This session will address community disruptions caused by certain residents. No one responded. No one nodded. Silence filled the room like water rising. She continued. Breaks a long drought. Delilah sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her smile gone, her voice strained as she tried to start the meeting. This session will address community disruptions caused by certain residents. No one responded. No one nodded. Silence filled the room like water rising. She continued talking, but her words no longer carried authority. Authority requires belief, and belief was gone. I didn't interrupt her. I waited. Because timing is the difference between pressure and talking, but her words no longer carried authority. Authority requires belief, and belief was gone. I didn't interrupt her. I waited. Because timing is the difference between pressure. This session will address community disruptions caused by certain residents. No one responded. No one nodded. Silence filled the room like water rising. She continued talking, but her words no longer carried authority. Authority requires belief, and belief was gone. I didn't interrupt her. I waited. Because timing is the difference between pressure and collapse. When she finished her prepared script, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said the sentence that would end her world and collapse. When she finished her prepared script, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said the sentence that would end her world and collapse. When she finished her prepared script, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said the sentence that would end her world. I think everyone here deserves to know who actually owns this lake. You could feel the air leave the room. Rodriguez placed the documents on the table one by one. the 1956 land grant. She continued talking, but her words no longer carried authority. Authority requires belief, and belief was gone. I didn't interrupt her. I waited, because timing is the difference between pressure. She continued talking, but her words no longer carried authority. Authority requires belief, and belief was gone. I didn't interrupt her. I waited, because timing is the difference between pressure and collapse. When she finished her prepared script, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said the sentence that would end her world. I think everyone here deserves to know who actually owns this lake. You could feel the air leave the room. Rodriguez placed the documents on the table one by one. The 1956 land grant and collapse. When she finished her prepared script, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech. I simply said the sentence that would end her world. I think everyone here deserves to know who actually owns this lake. You could feel the air leave the room. Rodriguez placed the documents on the table one by one. The 1956 land grant, the conservation trust, the access clause, the unpaid commercial usage by Westbrook Marine. It didn't feel like a presentation. It felt like a verdict. Every face shifted at the same time. Shock, then realization, then rage, not at me, at her. Delilah stood so fast her chair slammed into the wall. This is fabricated. The conservation trust, the access clause, the unpaid commercial usage by Westbrook Marine. It didn't feel like a presentation. It felt like a verdict. Every face shifted at the same time. Shock, then realization, then rage, not at me, at her. Delilah stood so fast her chair slammed into the wall. This is fabricated. Anxiety, but because silence in a newly freed community sounds different. It doesn't hum with tension. It breathes. I walked down to the dock with coffee in my hand and watched the water move like nothing had happened. Like nature doesn't acknowledge human arrogance. The lake didn't care about Delilah. The lake never did. But the community did. They were trained to believe order comes from authority. Even abusive authority. Removing the dictator wasn't enough. I had to remove the dependency she created. Rodriguez met me that afternoon in my workshop, the same place that had been destroyed only days earlier. It still smelled like motor oil and dust, but now it also smelled like possibility. She placed a stack of legal documents on the workbench, each one sharper than any weapon Delilah ever used. This is how we prevent another takeover, she said. Not with revenge, with structure. Not the kind Delilah built, but one that protects instead of controls. She outlined the plan the way only a strategist can. Calm, surgical, inevitable. The first step was dissolving the HOA permanently through a unanimous resident petition supported by legal precedent. Without Delilah to manipulate the process, the board folded instantly. No elections, no debates, no replacements. The second step was transferring community governance to a resident-elected lake management council with limited authority and transparent accountability. 3 rotating members, no permanent positions, no power accumulation, no ability to rewrite rules in the shadows. The third step was filing for state recognition of resident petition supported by legal precedent. Without Delilah to manipulate the process, the board folded instantly. No elections, no debates, no replacements. The second resident petition supported by legal precedent. Without Delilah to manipulate the process, the board folded instantly. No elections, no debates, no replacements. The second step was transferring community governance to a resident-elected lake management council with limited authority and transparent accountability. $1 could multiply into something larger than punishment. It could become restoration, habitat reconstruction, water quality improvement, shoreline stabilization, community access upgrades. The lake that Delilah weaponized could become the very thing that healed the neighborhood she fractured. But strategy isn't executed in paperwork alone. It requires presence. So that evening, I called the first community gathering, not in the clubhouse where Delilah ruled, but in my workshop where the community first rediscovered its voice. No formal seating, no podium, no theatrics, just neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time instead of... But in my workshop where the community first rediscovered its voice. No formal seating, no podium, no theatrics, just neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder for the first time instead of across a battlefield. The faces that once avoided mine now held something else, uncertainty mixed with relief. They didn't know what the future looked like. They only knew they didn't want the past. I didn't give a speech, I told the truth. You're not here because of what was taken. You're here because of what can be rebuilt. Across a battlefield, the faces that once avoided mine now held something else, uncertainty mixed with relief. They didn't know what the future looked like. They only knew they didn't want the past. I didn't give a speech, I told the truth. You're not here because of what was taken. You're here because of what can be rebuilt. We're done living under fear. We're done being punished for existing. We're rebuilding Willowbrook into something real, and nobody here will ever have to ask permission to want the past. I didn't give a speech, I told the truth. You're not here because of what was taken. You're here because of what can be rebuilt. Our own home again. The room didn't erupt. It settled. Because real relief doesn't shout. It exhales. The first step was addressing the financial damage Delilah caused. Residents who had been fined illegally received full reversals and documented clearance of their records. Every lien threat was withdrawn. Every violation notice invalidated. Every intimidation tactic erased. The next step was exposing what Delilah did to those who never had the chance to speak, and that required more than community meetings. We're done living under fear. We're done being punished for existing. We're rebuilding Willowbrook into something real, and nobody here will ever have to ask permission to live in their own home again. The room didn't erupt. It settled. Because real relief doesn't shout. It exhales. The first step was addressing the financial damage Delilah caused. It required law. Rodriguez filed a civil action supported by 43 individual witness statements, 14 years of selectively enforced violations, and the video. Residents who had been fined illegally received full reversals and documented clearance of their records. Every lien threat was withdrawn. Every violation notice selectively applied to enforce social hierarchy. Kids fished off docks without parents scanning for rule enforcers. Neighbors gathered without whispering. People used their own property without looking over their shoulders. But restoration doesn't feel real until something physical changes. So we used the trust funds, legally, transparently, publicly, to rebuild. Native plant restoration along the shoreline reversed erosion that had been ignored for decades. Water quality testing transitioned from a neglected annual formality into monthly monitoring that revealed contamination patterns Delilah never cared to notice. Community access improvements began. Dock repairs, safety lighting, and an accessible ramp for residents with mobility limitations. The moment Mrs. Naomi's grandson rolled onto that dock and cast his first line, the neighborhood finally understood what Delilah's power had cost them. Not just comfort, not just freedom. Connection. And here's where everything blew apart. The whisper network that once protected Delilah began protecting each other instead. Residents who once avoided Eye contact now shared tools, meals, conversations. The mailbox became a gathering place instead of an avoidance zone. The silence that once signaled fear now signaled peace. But the most significant shift didn't happen in policy or property. It happened in identity. Willowbrook was no longer a controlled environment. It was a community, not because of me, because people finally realized they were never powerless. They were only isolated. And isolation is the only thing that ever made Delilah dangerous. The legal outcome arrived months later. Delilah received a 4-year federal sentence for perjury, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. Her husband's business dissolved under financial penalties, restitution requirements, and license revocation. The HOA charter was permanently retired. No replacement allowed. The state adopted new protections preventing any future HOA in the region from operating without transparency and resident rights safeguards. But none of those victories were the real ending. The real ending happened quietly at the lake's edge, months after everything had settled. I stood on the dock at sunset with the water glowing orange beneath the sky finally free of tension. Sarah stepped beside me, her hand finding mine the way it always had before the war began. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Not the water, the air." She was right. Freedom doesn't sound like cheering. It sounds like nothing at all. Stillness without fear, calm without surveillance. Existence without permission. Delilah had tried to take my boat, my income, my home, my reputation. She failed because she misunderstood the one thing she never learned while ruling through intimidation. Power doesn't come from control. It comes from the ability to remove it. And in the end, she didn't lose because I fought back. Sky finally free of tension. Sarah stepped beside me, her hand finding mine the way it always had before the war began. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Not the water, the air." She was right. Freedom doesn't sound like cheering. It sounds like nothing at all. Stillness without fear, calm without surveillance. Sky finally free of tension. Sarah stepped beside me, her hand finding mine the way it always had before the war began. "It feels different now," she said softly. "Not the water, the air." She was right. Freedom doesn't sound like cheering. It sounds like nothing at all. Stillness without fear, calm without surveillance, contested territory. It felt like shared space. Residents gathered at the shoreline without looking over their shoulders, without bracing for violation notices disguised as community improvement. Children splashed in the water without parents counting how many minutes they were allowed to exist before someone complained. For the first time since I moved there, Willowbrook felt like a neighborhood instead of a controlled experiment. But the strangest part wasn't the freedom. It was the quiet. Not the tense quiet that used to hang over every interaction, but the kind that comes after a long storm finally breaks. People spoke to each other like they had always known how, even though fear had taught them to forget. Jim Morrison built a new fishing pier entirely through volunteer labor, and nobody asked for approval forms or compliance reviews. Dr. Patel started teaching neighborhood kids how to identify native fish species, turning what used to be restricted shoreline into an outdoor classroom. Beatrice organized weekend gatherings not to whisper about violations, but to share food without anyone scanning the room for a clipboard. Even Mrs. Patterson, who once crossed the street to avoid me, began stopping by with homemade peach cobbler, apologizing without saying the word. That's the thing about communities broken by intimidation. They don't need apologies to heal. They just need safety. But that's not even the half of it. The legal aftermath rippled far beyond Willowbrook. The FBI investigation uncovered similar HOA abuse patterns in 5 other communities tied to Westbrook Marine's influence. Homeowners who had been living under the same weaponized rule enforcement were finally released from fabricated violations and retaliatory fines. Delilah's fall became the case study that forced statewide reform. The legislature passed a homeowner bill of rights requiring transparent voting, mandatory notice periods, and prohibiting selective enforcement. The same system she used to crush people became the reason it could never happen again. Irony has a way of finishing what justice starts. But none of those victories were the real ending. The real ending was quieter. It happened on a late summer evening when the water was still enough to reflect the sky without distortion. I stood on the dock with Sarah, the boards warm beneath our feet, her hand resting into mine like it always had, even when everything around us was falling apart. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said everything. She looked out at the lake that had once been used as a weapon against us and exhaled slowly. I never thought it would feel peaceful again. I didn't either. Because peace doesn't return just because chaos ends. It returns when control does. The community didn't thank me with speeches or plaques. They thanked me the way real people do, by living without fear, by laughing without checking who was listening, by existing without permission. The trust funds that had once sat untouched now supported real projects. Water quality improvements, shoreline restoration, accessibility upgrades, college scholarships for local students studying environmental science and conflict resolution. The kind of legacy my Uncle Ezra had always intended but never got to witness. His old workshop had been turned into a community center, with his tools displayed like quiet reminders of what resilience looks like when it refuses to perform for attention. The plaque mounted on the wall read, "Ezra Kellerman, who protected what others tried to own." Every time I walked past it, I understood him more. He didn't avoid people because he disliked community. He avoided systems that confused control for structure. And now, decades later, the lake he safeguarded no longer belonged to silence. It belonged to everyone he hoped would one day deserve it. But here's the part nobody talks about. Victory doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like stillness. The end of a fight doesn't bring fireworks. It brings quiet clarity that settles into the bones. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and the water reflected it like fire cooling into embers, I heard footsteps on the dock. It was Mrs. Naomi's grandson, the boy who once got banned from the community dock for feeding ducks. He stood beside me holding a fishing rod that was too big for him, but perfect, in the way kids always believe they are ready for the world. "Mr. Marcus," he asked, "is the lake always going to be ours now?" I didn't rush to answer. I watched the water reflect the last strip of light before I finally spoke. "It was always yours. You just didn't know it yet." He nodded like he understood something bigger than the sentence, then cast his line into the water with the kind of confidence only children and free people have. And that was it. The moment I realized the war didn't end when Delilah lost. It ended when the smallest person in the neighborhood no longer felt like a trespasser. Not one neighbor watching from shore looked nervous. Not one person waited for permission. Not one voice whispered, "What if someone complains?" Because there was no one left to fear. The power trip ended instantly.